We'll just start with a quick round of introductions. So my name is Melissa Coe. I'm the Assessment and Curriculum Design Specialist in the Center for Teaching and Learning at UC Berkeley. I'll pass it on to Rachel.
Hi, everyone. My name's Rachel Wire. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Equitable Assessment Consultant in the Center for Teaching and Learning at UC Berkeley. I'll pass to Tara.
Hi, everyone. My name's Tara Mason. I'm the Universal Design for Learning consultant at the Center for Teaching and Learning. And I use she, her pronouns. I'm very happy to be here. And I will pass it to Courtney.
Good morning. I'm Courtney, and I use she, her pronouns. I am an instructional designer in the Center for Teaching and Learning at UC Berkeley.
Great. Well, we are so happy that you've decided to join us on a Friday morning. Today, we're going to be talking about Beyond the Checklist, rethinking rubrics to honor the process of learning. And in essence, our conversation today is going to sort of recap a project that we've been working on. It is funded by an AI Fast grant it's essentially from the state of California. They have a mechanism called, the California Education Learning Labs. I think some people on this call might be familiar with them and their mission. So they funded us to embark on a project to really, again, rethink assessment in the age of generative AI. So we're going to talk a little bit about what our process has been so far, what are things we've been noticing, what are major challenges, and of course, we invite you all to chime in and ask questions wherever you would like. So to kick things off, I think that Gen AI is one of many recent disruptors, as they might call it, or it leads to a provocation, which is really thinking about what are the goals of education. I mean, I think that's broadly true, but I think higher education is a particular area where there's been a lot of existential crises, for lack of better word, where we're really thinking about, what are we trying to accomplish? What are we doing? How do we stay relevant and so forth? So Gen AI is really inviting us to think a lot about what are the goals of our courses, our curriculum, our programs, and also the way we assess those. So I am perhaps preaching to the choir when I, point to this figure where we think a bit about how ideally in the design of our courses and curriculum, we have this connection between our goals, our assessments, and what is actually happening during class or even outside of class, like what are the activities students are engaged in. And all of those are hopefully supposed to inform one another and be well aligned. But of course, then things get shaken up in this triangle when, with the rise of AI, we are really asking ourselves what are students supposed to get out of a college education, and how do we assess now what students are actually learning in the course? I mean, for the second question, I'd say that's probably been true. We always are striving for better assessment methods to really gauge learning in our students. But nonetheless, I think that's now made more challenging with the rise of generative AI. And so you might be wondering where this connects now to rubrics. I mean, ultimately for us, we think of goals, learning goals as really informing what the rubrics have in them. The rubric should be aligned to the learning goals. And that whatever the rubrics express in terms of the standards for the goals and what success looks like, the assignment prompt should make sense with whatever the rubric is asking of the students. And so all of these, again, should hopefully be connected. And also, I'll welcome my presenters at any time to chime in, especially when we start getting into telling about what we've been noticing. But I'm just really trying to set up the background. I'm sure this group might be familiar with the AAC&U value rubrics. Again, I think the AAC&U has done a very good job of articulating a lot of these really complex higher order skills that likely a set of them are what your institution would consider important and a lot of disciplines would consider important. So to name two that we focused on, critical thinking, I feel like that's probably important in most disciplines, and information literacy, the ability to, research and find information and really suss out what is credible and valid against other things. So these, I think, are really important. I think they are an area where a lot of disciplines can come together and kind of agree that these matter in college education. And a lot of them, I think, why we honed in on these was actually we heard so many concerns that they matter more than ever, right? I think there's been so much dialogue. You've seen articles or heard people say things like, with AI, can students even think for themselves anymore? Or with AI, how do students know what's real anymore? How do the, hallucinations, etc. So I think these are not only areas where I think a lot of people, a lot of disciplines, a lot of faculty would agree these are valuable still more than ever, but also they're an area definitely that's perceived as under threat with the rise of generative AI. So again, AAC&U has articulated that also as like this really core skill in college education, but they've also created their own rubrics, right? They've created their own standards. They've decompose something as complex as critical thinking into like, well, what are the steps of that? What do they look like? And what does success look like, right? In their case, I mean, again, these are, the types of program level rubrics that we talk a lot about in the world of assessment, as opposed to the grading rubrics that focus a lot on like not good enough versus good and you get full points. In this case, it's thinking about the growth of students, right? They might enter as benchmark, but we really hope that through all of their cumulative educational experiences, they eventually get to capstone. And so the AAC&U has done a great job of laying that out. And that has been, I mean, raise your hand if you've used the AAC&U value rubrics in some way, like even just as a starting point. I mean, I rarely meet anyone who just like wholesale adopts it, but it is absolutely where I go to start like articulating these skills, and I massage and adapt from there. So it's a very, reliable, well-known resource. Um, but we were really, yeah, and they're completely free. They're under Creative Commons license. You can use them, remix and adapt them. So you're highly encouraged to do so. They've been vetted and tested at a lot of different institutions and institution types. A lot of eyes have been on them. So there's a lot of value to them, pardon the pun. But nonetheless, we were really curious what our own students and instructors thought of these rubrics, and especially what they thought of them given generative AI. Like, how well do people perceive them as working and being applicable when generative AI is out there and people may or may not be using it? So that was kind of the premise, and I can talk a little bit about some of the work we did that my entire team here all were part of. We basically invited a bunch of our own instructors and students at UC Berkeley to participate in stratified, so instructor only versus student only focus groups on generative AI. And these focus groups were facilitated by, the four of us who are on this call. We basically start off with recruiting. They filled out just an initial pre-survey, so we got a sense of who they were, and that helped us to identify who to invite to follow-up focus groups. And I have some information here about who those folks were. Berkeley is striving towards being a Hispanic serving institution. We are already an AAC, so there was a decent chunk of Asian identifying or Hispanic Latin identifying participants. We also were hoping for some gender diversity. And so you can see here we have 9% transgender, gender nonconforming. We do have 66% women. It's not necessarily that we have 66% women at Berkeley, especially among instructors. It's more that we've just kind of noticed this trend that when we have focus groups, women are much more likely to want to participate. I don't know if others have noticed this, by the way. I just feel like whenever we've run focus groups at our own institution, women are by far more likely to want to participate and actually to respond to participating. What was the total number of participants? That's a great question. Oh my gosh. If any of my colleagues on the call want to double check how many total, we ran 14 focus groups. I'm trying to remember exactly how many. It like averaged like the instructor focus groups are generally smaller, but if any of my colleagues on the call want to pull up how many people total participated in our focus groups, I apologize, should have had that on the slide. But we did ask them about some of their other identities. 25% were first generation and or low income, and 14% were living with a disability. So if you read our abstract, this was us trying to have our work be informed by our students and our instructors. I will say we also went to some experts. So we did actually work with our own university librarians that might seem really obvious because they're part of our institution, but I feel like not everyone knows that your librarians can be an amazing resource. And specifically, we have a division in our library that is focused on instruction. Like they basically partner with instructors to teach Research 101 to undergraduates. And so they have a lot of experience working with students on, how do you find a source? How do you, like, what keywords do you look for and so forth? And so they were an invaluable partner and they were kind of the expert voice on the rubrics. Like we all came together to reckon with what the rubrics said and what we thought were the issues around that. All right, so this is where I'm going to also open it up for my colleagues to chime in. When we basically brought the rubrics to these conversations, I'm not getting into a ton of detail about the focus groups because they were actually a lot more complicated. There were activities and so forth, but the core theme were that students or instructors would, again, come around one of the value rubrics and the criteria and sort of essentially critique it or struggle with it, talk about it. That was like the core theme. And there were just some things we noticed that were really concerning to us. So I'll describe this first one. Students just mapped the rubric criteria to components of an essay. And I mean, it makes sense, and yet it's also not great, right? I think there's ways in which it makes sense that the common vehicle for assessing critical thinking is a paper of some sort, but it's definitely disheartening to see students look at something like, oh, you're able to like, you know, grapple with some like really complex issue and then arrive at like this interesting or meaningful conclusion, and they just think of it as this like really passe like conclusion paragraph at the end of an essay that like they just regurgitate things and it doesn't mean anything. And so it was really alarming to us how much they just mapped it to this product, the deliverable, and really diminished the value of certain items because they perceive them as being the less important parts of a paper rather than like the process of going through critical thinking. Like first you need to understand the issue and like eventually you have to, wrap up and bring your thoughts together in some like coherent, meaningful way. Like that's the habit of mind. Students just thought of it as the paper. And so it was kind of alarming again that it felt very disconnected from real life. And some students actually articulated that. They're like, this feels so academic and I think of critical thinking as being like, how do I vote? And they're like, that has no connection to this rubric. Like, this rubric doesn't capture that at all. So that was a major issue that we perceived. I'll open it up to some of my colleagues who want to handle some of these other areas.
Hi all. This is Tara. I found maybe one participant number that I put inside the chat. And then while I was looking for that, Melissa, did you talk about both groups identifying certain criteria as less important now, or do you want me to cover that one?
Yeah, sorry, I know you're working on two levels. Yes, if you'd like to cover that one.
Yeah. Well, and so, we talked about what are some of the things that a human can do, what are some of the things that a machine can do, what are some of the things that maybe human and machine, as it related to generative AI. And I think that there was a lot of discussion about there were some areas that felt less important, that got surfaced in our focus groups. And so one of the things that stuck out to me was being able to explain a thing seemed less important, both to students and instructors. And so that was something that got talked about in the focus groups. And I think what my takeaway from that was that, being able to have an understanding of it, being able to apply it, being able to critically think about a thing, but just the sheer ability to explain how a thing works felt very able to be looked up and felt very able to be kind of offloaded. And so that was a big takeaway I had, and I'll welcome other folks to chime in on some of the other ones.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, I think what sticks out to me is also like summarizing information, synthesizing information seemed like one of those things that folks felt was more amenable to being sort of offloaded, as opposed to things like taking a position. That sort of, by contrast, felt a bit more like something that needs to be done by the author, by a human author.
And I did want to just quickly mention, because I feel like we probably covered it, but or emphasize rather that the looking up of information or the researching component was another that was kind of dismissed, like, oh, that's not quite as important. And being a previous information librarian, information literacy librarian, that always it just grinded my gears because the just the deficit of AI literacy skills, I guess, not understanding that it's potentially offloading research chores, tasks to a generative AI wasn't actually going to result in any actual information retrieval, since using an LLM, which is basically what we were covering, isn't retrieving information. So that was another point where I kind of was like flagging, like, we should have explained this a little more, or why is this coming about? So it was another sort of interesting um, discovery.
And another thing I was thinking that I would add on just to that I thought was interesting is there was so much disconnect between what instructors thought and what students thought. So there was a lot of kind of kind of crossing each other in their thinking. And one of them I think was around student voice. So instructors felt like they really wanted students to be able to understand the thing really fully and be able to show that, whereas, you know, but at the same time, they didn't necessarily prize student ideas or opinions on it. So, I mean, it was kind of there was a disconnect there, and students felt like instructors don't want me to insert too much of my personal opinion. And so I felt almost like instructors it's like they were arguing with themselves sometimes in the focus groups. They were like, no, 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 I want to hear students' ideas, but I really do want them to be able to say it in a way that's correct for the discipline. And it was like, well, what do you want? Do you want them to tell you their ideas? Or do you want them to say it in a poised way that you feel like is the right essay? And students always went back to this idea that instructors want to see this really polished product. They don't want to hear my ideas. They don't want to hear my stance on things. And so I noticed, I thought that was really interesting. And I also picked up on some of that in other student conversations where the ways they were using generative AI was to check their work and that would then kind of remove a lot of their voice from their work because like the layer that they were using was to make sure their work looked polished and looked really professional. And again, instructors were like, "Oh no, we want them to tell us their voice." And it was like, "But do you?" Because it seems like you're grading for that really poised essay at the end. And that's what students think you want. And so that's what they're trying to give you. So, and I think that kind of speaks to what Melissa, I kind of brought the conversation full circle. It speaks to how Melissa started the discussion where they mapped criteria to the components of an essay.
Yeah, and I think also I also am thinking about how many of our students shared that kind of conundrum, that tension really like forced them to submit work that didn't feel like it aligned with their values. Many of the students pointed out that, writing that they've seen that's AI generated feels like it's just lacking something. They used words like it's lacking like humanity or it's lacking a soul. Um, Many of them pointed out that this writing just didn't really feel like compelling because a person didn't write it. And so it's interesting that they have to contend with this tension of really knowing what I guess what they would call like kind of non-human writing looks like or soulless writing looks like, but not being able to put their own humanity into their writing or not feeling that they can put their own humanity into their writing because of all this pressure to submit this very polished product.
While folks have been chiming in, I tried to share some resources in the chat to answer some questions. I shared that we had 44 total focus group participants. That was very skewed towards the instructor focus groups being small and a struggle. If anyone has any tips on how they've gotten that to work, I would love to hear it. The student focus groups were a lot easier to recruit for and actually get folks to show up. And I also shared our pre-survey. It is not the most amazing pre-survey. I think we were really curious to honor like folks having a lot of different relationships with generative AI in the same conversation. Our maybe I should have started with this. At UC Berkeley, I would say generative AI is very contentious. You have anything from the like hyper adopter thinks that we like that college education should absolutely include having students use AI, have them learn about AI. Like this person tries to use AI in every part of their own life, all the way from someone who's like, we should go as low tech as possible. Like we should only focus on like reading in a circle, talking, connecting. AI has no part in that. I don't use it. I don't want my students to use it, right? And everything in between. So it's a very contentious issue on your campus, and we want to try to represent those different perspectives, but also, again, have some identity, diversity, disciplinary diversity in the conversation together. And again, I pointed to the San Diego State has done the generative AI survey at such a scale too, so you have a lot of comparison points. Like I forget exactly how many Cal States they've gotten to engage with their own survey. Like they've really tried to partner across their whole system to have lots of data about, again, feelings towards generative AI. So that survey, if you need something more robust, might be a better fit. And then I saw a question about, yeah, I mean, unclear how much of the culture shift from K-12 to college really shakes things up in terms of, again, how students perceive what success looks like and what they're being asked to do. Again, a lot of students did value things that were very personal. Like they thought their own position on a matter was incredibly important. They're like, it says student position. That's me. Like, that's so important. Like, I need to have a stance in the world. And yet, actually, several instructors thought that was not as important as other elements, like being able to, you know, pull in evidence and present it in compelling ways, etc. So it's just interesting, again, that I think students feel it, like they feel personally that it is really valuable, and yet somehow they're perceiving that their instructors don't care, and some of them don't. So that was really interesting. And yeah, I mean, hopefully we will get to some of the comments about like how can we maybe use like what are like something in between, right? Like not just, you know, students only do the assignments by themselves versus AI entirely do it. We pose that question more to in the context of this study when we posed the question of like, should this be man or machine, essentially, the reason we did that was to kind of push them a little to articulate, you know, could a generative AI be allowed to do it? Or is this something that really should be a human responsibility? And we were kind of challenging them. I realize it's kind of a false dichotomy, but we wanted them to really think and essentially kind of argue with each other or try to convince each other of their choices. And that kind of surfaced a lot for us about how they were thinking about the skills and the pieces of the skills, but also bringing their own identities or disciplines into the conversation. Like in my discipline, this is really important because of XYZ. So yeah, I don't think that it's necessarily that it has to be one or the other. It's just that was how we set up the conversation to put them in a challenging state, right? Like we didn't want a focus group where everyone was like agreeing all the time and everything was really easy to decide. Yeah.
I wanted to note also, just because it's come up in other presentations and discussions, that we have the focus group information, but the focus groups took place almost exactly a year ago. And so there has been, we just talked about how this morning, you know, OpenAI has loaded a new GPT. So there's so much change and so quick, such changes happening at such a rapid rate that that insight would probably be different if we were to do it now, just because a year has passed and this is something that everyone's interested in and following. And so there's a lot of new developments and new information reaching students and teachers and staff all at the same time. So that's just another point I wanted to emphasize.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I just want to leave off that I think we've actually touched on in part of our conversation is that, again, both groups looked at the AAC&U value rubric as a starting point, and a lot of them felt that generative AI could pass as competent in a lot of those criteria. Even if they identified something as uniquely human, I think there were ways in which they thought, oh, well, when it comes to looking at a paper that generative AI produces, with things like ethical use of sources, they're like, Gen AI can look like it's, crediting the relevant people and ensuring that it's respecting this or that. But, under the surface, it's like there's no ethical, the machine can't take on an ethical stance. It's a machine. And so I think that both groups acknowledge that when you're just looking at the end point, that generative AI could look like it's accomplishing all of these things. So that, again, was a very big concern for us. So I will say that we tried to take all of this feedback plus the conversations we were already having internally with our, university librarian partners, and we were trying to, essentially make our own updated version of the value rubrics for critical thinking and information literacy. So again, we only focused on those two for scoping, and we were trying to think about like, how can we rewrite the standards to feel more human. And of course, that led to some predictable changes based on all this conversation. Process being very important. Like, as we were articulating the rubrics, we were like, we're going to kind of throw feasibility out the window. We're just going to focus on what these skills are. What are the pieces of it? Like when we are going through a research like when we're developing a research thing, we absolutely look up sources and actually throw some sources away. We're like, oh, well, this seemed relevant, but it actually wasn't. And that never appears anywhere in your final product. But that is part of the process, is like, again, pivots and serendipitous discoveries and picking up one thing and then throwing it away. Like that discernment is a really important skill in the process. And so we just threw all that in. We're like, if it's human, if it really does reflect the skill, let's include that. And so we put all that in. We were just like, let's just do it. Let's do something that feels, again, human and more complete than what the value rubrics were. Of course, that led to a lot more criteria. If any of you have dealt with the AAC&U value rubrics, they collapse critical thinking into 5 skills. We were not able to do that at all. So we had way more rows in our rubric. But that was kind of what we were working towards, which was like, let's just be ambitious. Let's just articulate these things and worry about the implementation later. And so as Courtney mentioned, we did the research a year ago. We were working on revising the rubrics as we were getting more and more data and, working internally. And then this whole academic year, so the fall semester and this current spring semester, is kind of, again, when we've now tried to be putting this into practice. Sorry, it's not proceeding. So again, putting into practice is like, we have really been articulating like, what are the goals? What do those goals look like? Or what do success in those goals look like? So really the rubrics. And now we have to go back to instructors and be like, well, if we put this in practice, obviously the assessments have to somehow align, right? Like if we need to achieve the goals, how do we prompt students to do the things that make these goals measurable or visible, observable, etc. So finally, eventually, we were like, now we need to be practical and talk about how we do this. I have seen chat moving, so I'm just like taking a quick peek at what people asked. Yeah, I see a question about, did we encounter any resistance in rubrics? I'm trying to remember. I mean, I've definitely, in my own career, met a lot of people who are really resistant to rubrics. I think maybe this is again a methodological detail. Technically, for some of these conversations, we were really exposing them to the rubrics. Other ones were more like, here's how they define critical thinking. What do you think of this? Here's what they think are the components of critical thinking. What do you think of this? So we kind of have broken it down in a way where it like might not look exactly like a rubric, but we were thinking again much more of like the meat of what was in the rubric, like what are the the skills that you would expect students to learn and be able to demonstrate and that you would see in their work. So I feel like for some of the instructors, we maybe tricked them because we didn't like just show them the rubric and say, talk about it. Like we kind of went through it stepwise and like talked about the pieces of it without being like, here's your rubric. Imagine you're grading an essay. What would you do? Um, so I think that was kind of an important caveat to, some people don't like using rubrics in their teaching. I think we kind of maybe stealthily engage them nonetheless. Let's see, are values still perceived as helpful given the movement towards? I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, Lena. If you want to try rewording your second question, or you feel free to unmute. I'm not sure that I am, maybe I think some of my colleagues may be taking a stab. I'm not entirely sure if I understand the second part of your question.
I'm sorry, you actually answered. I was more concerned about or interested in hearing about your experience with talking about rubrics and the value of rubrics. I'm sorry, I was trying to reframe the question and it just seemed like just combined it, truncated the two responses. Yeah, I was just wondering because I feel like when I talk about rubrics and in the age of AI, I do get some resistance now more than ever in terms of the value. So I was wondering if you heard anything about that through your focus groups.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we quite heard that particular piece, but I think actually, I don't know. I don't feel like I've heard resistance to rubrics necessarily in the age of AI because it's like I think a lot of ways being objectively correct, like for a very closed-ended task, I feel like generative AI can do that very well. So I feel like rubrics lend themselves to more open-ended assignments. So I would kind of be surprised that people really dislike something that's oriented towards open-ended assignments versus something that's closed-ended that Gen AI could like rock any day of the week, right? Like literally a Chrome extension could just rock a quiz online, right? So I don't know, that's interesting to me. I mean, I think what we've heard more again is just like for purposes of grading, maybe I'm using the rubric to evaluate what I see, but do I know where it came from? Or again, thinking about the threshold, like what is the benchmark I now expect, and should that now move because of generative AI? I think that's been more the conversation is again, issues of academic integrity and also the issue now of like, what should we expect of students? I hope
And
that helps.
And Melissa, I would add one of the things that I was saying in the chat about the rubrics that I feel like has been a conversation on our team is the process versus product. And so the rubric, I think that there's a lot of echoing for instructors to think about the rubric as grading the product. And with generative AI, there needs to be so much more emphasis on the process of learning, and the rubric could be a great tool for that. And I think that it's really hard for instructors at varying levels of teaching background to kind of see the rubric as a helpful tool. And I think we were trying to kind of integrate it into that and to, kind of help shift that mindset. Like this is not just a tool to grade the demonstrated product because we all agree that maybe that's pretty fraught in the age of generative AI because that product could have been created by the machine. But like, how do you help students think about their process? Because we might have to shift some of our teaching, our thinking, our assessment over to process, um, knowing that generative AI might be creating a lot of products. And so we want to help students broaden their awareness of their learning. The rubric could be a helpful tool with that. But I think that's a mindset shift.
Yeah, I mean, this might be a bit of a tangent for what I'm going to talk about next, but I think so many of the conversations I've had around these rubrics or rubrics in general, I mean, really what has happened is rubrics have kind of evolved to be a way to quickly assign a grade and to justify the grade you're given, right? Like so when and to give credit to instructors, like our learning management system is literally built around that, right? Like you will set up a rubric and it'll be like each level gives like 2 out of 5 points if you click this cell, and people are used to like setting it up because it literally that's the default. And so they're used to setting it up that way and just thinking of it as like, oh, when I need to standardize and grade this objectively, this rubric, I just click the things that make sense and then it'll spit out a grade and I'll feel good about that, right? And so I think it's really because of that culture that's been created around rubrics, I think it's really hard to be like, oh, well, like, can you still have this rubric and really think of it as very growth minded, right? Like, we know that AAC&U value rubrics, if you were to look at work from a freshman class, students might be introductory level or like benchmark level, and that's okay because that's where they are in their development. And so I think there's really this, and for any student who looks at it, they'll be like, oh my God, I'm not at the top column, I'm losing points, right? Like that's become, again, the culture around rubrics. And so because of that, I think again it's geared much more towards looking at the deliverable. We think of it as being very objective. And I think when we think of process, we're like, oh, process, that's subjective. And it's like, well, actually, rubrics are very subjective. And I think we just want them to be objective because then they feel like they justify the grades. But what if we took the grades out of it and it wasn't so literally mechanistically linked that if I clicked expert, you would get an A, right? Like I think we've been trying to work on disentangling that when we talk to instructors. Let's see. I don't know if there's been any other questions I can answer. Yeah, okay. I don't know if there's other questions, but feel free to add them in chat or unmute. I don't know about we are recording, so I think there will be records if people need to reference that later.
Lisa,
Yeah.
there's a question from Virginia, Maureen, and that was I was gonna ask the same question, kind of, talking about disciplines, specific discipline. How do you go about using rubrics to specific disciplines, especially when you have different type of assessments, right? Like authentic assessments, formative assessments.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, when we were developing this rubric, I think we did spiral around what I'm sure is a problem already with the AAC value rubrics, which is like that some wording feels much more like a certain discipline. And that did absolutely come out of the instructor focus groups. People in certain disciplines all like connected to the idea of critical thinking, but for some of them it was much more like creative thinking, and for some of them it was more like reasoning around data and that you're doing with an experiment or something or other. So I do think that while the spirit was shared, a lot of times they would take issue with really specific words because it just felt like it wasn't their discipline. And so sometimes it's like just a new coat of paint. And I'm very open to that when I work directly with departments. Like I'll bring them essentially a remixed version of a value rubric based on what they've told me their learning outcomes are. And then they sometimes want a coat of paint that really makes it feel like biology or feel like theater studies. And I think that's valid, right? Like I think they want it to feel representative and just like they don't want this dissonance when they're reading it and trying to mark things because they're like, oh, that's not what I would call it. So we usually put on a new coat of paint for them. But I think a lot of the underlying skills actually are similar, at least personally from working with academic program review and working with a lot of different disciplines and departments. I'm just like, y'all care about critical thinking, y'all care about communication. Like it's not that different. Like the underlying like core lasting skills of a, four-ish year degree. A lot of those were actually very common, but they did want it to sound like the way they talked about it. And that's valid. Again, that's valid. I don't want them to be marking the rubric and just feel like it's wrong in some way. Let's see. I don't know if there are any other questions, but I just want to quickly just talk a little bit about, because we hinted at this, that we're in the implementation phase. So we've been partnering with instructors to really think about their assignment design. So we've done some partnerships in the fall, partnerships in the spring. I will be fully transparent that for the sake of this AI fast funded project, we did focus in on mostly classes in social sciences and humanities. And yeah, that was very intentional. A lot of Berkeley STEM courses are ginormous, first of all, and that really complicates how they do assessment. And so we just know that that's going to be complicated. And again, I think there is sometimes the biggest jump in the coat of paint, if you will, going from theater studies to biology. So we were like, okay, for the sake of just like, we had to do this all in a year and a half. So we were like, we're just going to mostly focus on social sciences and humanities classes. You can see a couple here, sociology, rhetoric, history of art, Asian American studies, education, history, etc. So we mainly focus, and on some Cole Wright is basically our reading and composition courses, which a lot of students take because they're required to have some sort of reading and writing training unless they, get credit elsewhere. So we've been partnering with these folks to rethink the design of assignments in their class. And I want to kind of clarify what that means. We asked them as part of partnering with us to pick at least one assignment in their course where they made it such that students could or maybe were prompted to at least somewhat critically engage with generative AI. We were working with some instructors who had previously just banned it. Like they were like, you're not allowed to use generative AI as part of any assignment. So it was kind of a bit of a out of their comfort zone for some of them. We were basically asking them to take one assignment and even with some guardrails, essentially allow students to use generative AI as part of their learning process. So that was for some people a bit of a stretch, not so much for others. And again, we were thinking of it as, again, that whatever resulted from that would be some mix of some students who, maybe are conscientious objectors and don't like to use generative AI and don't use it at all. But then there's some students who are submitting work that, again, is influenced by their engagement with generative AI. So that was the first piece, was we just picked an assignment and we opened things up a little and allowed some flexibility where perhaps previously there was none around using generative AI. The second thing we did was we really encouraged them to look at our revised rubrics and try to think about, ideally the assignment from the beginning kind of aligned with some pieces of it, but we also encouraged them to pick like which ones felt like they were a good fit for that assignment. Because again, there's a ton of rows. If you guys are looking at my link for the revised rubrics, there's a ton of criteria. There's a lot going on there. We asked them to just kind of pick, for what the assignment is, for what the course is, like what made sense in that context. So they picked those, and then we would engage in conversations around, again, maybe they had an essay that previously banned AI and now they're trying to open it up. So they want to talk to us about like, oh, well, how could I do that? Like, how can I ensure students are still learning? What should my policy be for this paper? What are guardrails? So we had a lot of conversations with them about the redesign of this assignment, especially more so for those who had been very against any AI use at all. So we did that. And again, we've been noticing what happens during those conversations. Also noticing that we actually got some money to pay a team of graduate readers who are now marking the student work against the rubric. Talking to them has been fascinating about what they're noticing in terms of student work, but really the huge chasm that they're perceiving between our rubrics and the assignment/student work. So that's really what we're going to speak to now, is the challenges we've been noticing as we've been implementing this and actually having folks evaluate student work in this context. I also saw a big question come in. No, maybe not. Oh, that might have been just Tara. Sorry. I was like,
Yeah,
I'll see the chat move and I'm like, question. I'm glad y'all are so active. You have it covered.
Yes, I just put some of the ideas of what instructors did just to help fill in all the great stuff you were saying.
Yeah, and again, I think it's the case, just being very transparent whenever you're partnering with a lot of different instructors. Some of them are very like, again, they all have a range of different relationships and feelings towards generative AI, and they went about this in different ways. I think our whole idea is we just didn't want to work with anyone who had an assignment that just banned it entirely. Like that was definitely not a good fit. But there were some instructors who simply said, hey, at this brainstorming step, you could use AI, but you could also not. That's fine. And some of them were like, oh, you should try to use AI. Like, I would like you to try to use AI as another feedback person in addition to either peer review or a review from me. Like, I would like you, I'm asking you to just like try that and see how it goes. Yes, we did provide incentives. So instructors, that's part of why it's also a limited pilot, is our own bandwidth to work directly with every instructor. We wanted to support them as much as they needed. But yes, we gave instructors at Berkeley, we have to give them what we call course improvement grants. It's basically give them a little piggy bank of money that they're allowed to use for things like going to conferences or I guess paying for class supplies, bringing in a guest speaker. So yeah, we give them a little bit of money to as part of this process. But yeah, on this slide here, I'm sharing some of the challenges that have really come up. So I'll speak to the first one, and then I'll let some of my colleagues feel free to chime in to some of the other ones. Um, Again, there was our readers who are the ones directly going in there. They're on the front line of reading all of these student submissions and going to the rubric that the instructor picked, right? The instructor, we didn't pick for them. We didn't make any sort of like guesses, like the instructor, and very often in conversation with the CTL representative, engaged in conversation like what criteria fit. They kind of tried to read the assignment instructions, the person thought about their class and the goals of their whole class, and they picked the rubric. It's a very informed choice of rubric. And yet, again, as the readers are looking at the student work, looking at the goals, they're just like, I don't see this. I'm not seeing the connection here. Some of these things are very hard to assess. They are not made observable to me. And so that was a big issue where it's interesting to us again that some instructors can look at a rubric and be like, these things fit, like this is a match. And yet others will look at it and be like, I don't see any match. None of these things are made observable to me. So that was really fascinating to us how much of a disconnect there was there. Any of my colleagues want to chime in about some of these other ones?
I wanted to note just kind of separately is kind of from what Anne said in the comments about the rubrics that are measuring things that the teachers, identified as things that would be taught or available to be viewed through this assignment in the class. I actually worked with a teacher who was adamant that he every time we would go through the rubric, he would say, "Well, I'm not teaching that, so how can I ask strangers to measure it?" And the strangers being the student readers. And so that was a really interesting part of what came about within that class, like tailoring the language, trying to identify room for teaching opportunities of these kind of critical thinking skills, because we just eliminated the information literacy in that class because he was, he couldn't like morally put that, and I totally respected it, obviously. He couldn't put that measure to a paper that he hadn't taught information literacy skills. And so we looked at the critical thinking skills that he felt like he was covering, and then we were able to kind of reword the rubrics. And there's still um, a really difficult challenge to have even with the language modified, to kind of observe the rubric listed items in the student work.
Yeah, I mean, Courtney, what's so fascinating, I don't want to speak to your specific scenario, but in general, I think what's really fascinating about that is just having an instructor be like, oh, well, how can I expect this from them if I don't teach it? I mean, that's in some ways refreshing because I think, we always worry about the case where we expect something from students that we haven't really set them up to succeed in. But I think it's interesting because it's like, well, sometimes you actually are expecting those, even if you don't name it explicitly, that might be like a component of being successful that's like implicit, right? Like to actually be really good at this paper and get an A, you will need to do those things even when I don't cover them. So again, not your specific scenario, but I think that's just an interesting observation that some of these they might be like, oh, I didn't cover this or I didn't explicitly ask for this, but it's like, oh, like but would you give a paper a better grade if they're really good at that thing? Like, is that not actually something you are taking into account under the surface? I don't know, Rachel, Tara, if you want to weigh in some of these other points, or I can go through them.
Yeah, I just put in the chat that I feel like when I thought about instructor assignments, I was thinking about one in particular that was so it was it was a great assignment that I really understood this idea of critiquing what generative AI came up with. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. That'll be so interesting. But students really weren't able to kind of make that leap between kind of seeing what generative AI came up with and then comparing it to the important learning concepts that were true for that class. It was just like there was too much complexity there going on. And so the ones that I feel like have been more successful have been a little bit more open, where students are able to use it and then reflect on their use of it and whether or not it was helpful, not helpful. And I think, I think that that could kind of go like this lack of prompts for process pieces of metacognition. I feel like the more open, where students then just reflected, felt a little bit easier to really think a little bit about what that generative AI component looked like in the assignment. And since there's also so much change going on, as Courtney was pointing out, it's so generative AI is just prolifically changing. And I don't know if you said that, Melissa, but anyway, one of us. But it just keeps changing is essentially the message here. And so trying to control for it just feels futile. And so the ones that felt more open, I feel like were more successful and gave us better information.
Yeah, and around that lack of prompts for process pieces or metacognition, I want to give like I want to highlight Anne's comment about there would need to be a pretty extensive cover letter. And I just want to actually surface that by design, actually one of our instructors already who was working with us was like, oh, I already asked them to like put a little cover letter, like this will be their final draft. I asked them to do this and that. And it was essentially asking students to reflect on or document their process. And I sat down and talked to a reader, and we were kind of just talking about this whole project. And he happened to be reviewing those submissions. And he was like, I would read the paper and then I'd look at the cover letter, and like so much would like become clear to me. Like he'd read the paper and he'd be like, I don't know, I'm trying to mark these items, but a lot of them again are very human and process oriented, and he wasn't really confident. And then he would look to the cover and liner and he's like, I just feel like I understand the students so much better now. And so again, I think that's something that more and more, how much are we asking students to basically have like in the margins meta commentary around all of the stuff that they're producing. I think that's so important now because again, it's really hard to just look at a final project and suss out like how did they get here? Sometimes you do collect milestones like the rough draft and then the final, but again, how did they get there? Like how did you get from point A to point B? Can be the very human part, and that part, unless you ask them, like you have to ask them to include it as part of the assignment, otherwise you just have no idea. So that was really important. I'm seeing questions about misalignment. Yeah, how can we help instructors to actually align? Well, that's a big part of our guidance now, is that we're really trying to think of ways that because our revised rubrics really ask for process. We're really thinking about how we can provide exemplars of what that means. I want to be clear that it's imperfect. Like part of our provocation of this whole talk is that we really struggle. Like we kind of all circulate around like, oh, well, we could ask for this or this, but really, is that like going to fully demonstrate the process? So much is happening internally that we will never observe. And so we kind of spiral around that. But I think we are hoping to provide more exemplars of that because that's something that is just a repeated misalignment, is like that instructors will point to a criteria that's like, oh, they engaged in this iterative inquiry. And then the reader looks at the final paper and is like, what iterative inquiry? Like, what do you mean? So I think that's something that we're hoping to bridge just by providing examples of what that actually means and looks like. And for some people, that's obvious. Some people are used to having cover letters, but some people have never done that in their teaching before. Like that does not occur to them to ask for like student sidebars in everything that they submit. So we're hoping that will partially address it. I want to answer Enrique's question. Actually, I want to be very clear that for this pilot, this assessment is actually all happening in the background and it doesn't affect students' grades currently at all. We basically told instructors we want to evaluate against the rubric to see what's happening. Like it's like aspirational, but we told them like you can grade exactly the same way you would usually grade. Like you don't have to change that at all. And so how a student was evaluated against this rubric would have no bearing on their grade in any ways that like wasn't already happening because of the way the instructor would typically grade. So I don't want to pretend that if a student was marked very low in critical thinking that their grade would still be great. I just think that how they marked against the rubric wasn't the way that they were assigned their grade. So we were not necessarily worried about it being student facing yet. But I do think that's just honestly a huge problem in general is that when I'm workshopping rubrics with different folks, like workshopping a rubric between, the value rubrics and members of the department, they tend to lean towards making things so aligned to their discipline that they feel very inaccessible to a student who's new to the discipline. So I think that's something that we always have to try to compromise on, that their coat of paint may actually make it really hard for a student to read and understand what it's trying to say. So I think that's something going forward that we would also want to think a lot about is like, how do students read and interpret our rubrics? Let's see, are there any other questions I have to address? Yeah, I hope I addressed all of those. I just want to quickly get to some of these other ones because I know some people leave on the hour. It was fascinating to us when we presented them with our rubrics and we're like, here's critical thinking, here's information literacy. Granted, some of the papers were like not very research oriented, like they just only use sources that came up in class, right? Like they were grappling with a single source or they were only using sources that had essentially been provided to them, especially in the case of, these freshmen reading and composition classes, they were kind of being fed that. Um, and so in some cases, it truly was the case that the rubric criteria weren't a good fit. But it was fascinating to us that when they had to pick and choose, they often did skip over what felt like the very human critical elements. So in the exact same focus groups way back where they're just like, oh, it's so important that students are aware of bias, that they're aware of their own bias, they're aware of existing bias in the discipline, that they're aware of the bias of generative AI. Like, and so we threw those in, right? And then later on, when we're now like implementing and asking them, which ones would you pick? Those were the ones that got picked less often. They were just like, that's not a good fit for my assignment. So it was like, that was interesting to us that that was such a valued part of the skill, and yet they were more likely to not include them as part of assignments or part of how they viewed success on an assignment. So that was skipped. And I would just also say, information literacy, again, we really tried to rewrite it as a process. We were so worried that everyone's focused on just, I need sources, I need a lot of good sources, these sources have to be credible, I need a nice references list at the very end. Like there is so much emphasis on that, and we really tried to pivot information literacy to being a habit of mind, like something you engage in. It's like just a practice, right? And as a result, many fewer instructors picked anything from that entire rubric. They just tended to leave it out entirely. Sometimes, again, that was meaningful, like it was a good fit for the assignment. Other times, I think they were just like, this is too hard. Like, how could I possibly know how they ended up finding the sources that they did? But it's like, isn't that the important part is how they found the sources and chose them? So again, that was a really interesting discrepancy. And I'll just sort of leave that we are still spiraling around this idea of to what extent will a deep learning process just be incompatible with a product that you can observe? And we are still struggling with that. We have no answers for you, but we are really hoping to work on providing as best of exemplars as we possibly can to our instructors based on all of these experiences and challenges that we've been through. So I want to thank you all for listening. You can follow our project. I don't know, Yarek or Enrique, do we usually post the slides afterwards for people to be able to see?
Yes, we'll post them on the blog. Yes, with
Okay, I was
all the
gonna say
materials and
that
everything.
way they
Yes,
can
yes,
click on the links. But
yes,
yeah, you
yes,
can kind of
definitely.
follow our project. I want to thank my whole team. The team is represented here, but we also had a team of undergraduate student researchers working with us. So they've been amazing and very informative in this entire process. And again, we're funded by the California Education Learning Lab. I'm happy to stick around if people want to ask specific questions, but I definitely wanted to let those go who had to leave at 11.
Right on. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was just great, very, very timely discussion. Very, very important. If you don't mind, I would like you to address this question of product versus process, right? Because I agree that comes up quite a bit. The point that I would like to make, however, is that ultimately students are responsible for handing in a paper, and that's, let's just say, before ChatGPT, right? Students were supposed to write something, turn it to the professor, get a grade. That's a product. Now that product apparently can be done with ChatGPT much more, right? 800 times more powerful, right, than anything ever that was ever done before. Okay, it's still the product, and we can argue, to what extent AI generated in and have those discussions about, policing AI. It's just that it's still a product. And when I think of asynchronous classes, where teachers don't even necessarily interact with students at all to see how their behavior specifically changes, product is the only artifact, the only proof that learning has taken place. Also, a product is going to be different for different students, right? Even if they interact with ChatGPT, to the to the maximum extent of the phrase, I suppose, they still produce something that's unique. Isn't that enough, or why wouldn't that be enough of to attest to the learning process, to what has happened? Because that must have been, no matter how short, it was still the process that produced it.
Yeah. Well, so I will say again, I think we have run into concerns. Of course, again, you brought up the academic integrity issue. Folks are going to definitely always bring that up and always take issue with that. Um, I think what's been really interesting again is how much instructors themselves are wondering again if students can use generative AI. Like if I realize, I'm quoting them, if they realize it's hopeless to try to ban it and that students will use it anyways, I think they're really grappling then with like what should the standards be for the resulting product. And I've heard a lot of dialogue around, oh, all the standards should be higher now. Like either because the generative AI makes things easier or it makes things better when they like, together we go farther. Like there's been a lot of dialogue about just having higher standards. And I don't want to like knock having high standards for students, but I think that's just a really interesting thing to think about for the students who, again, are conscientious objectors, hate generative AI for a variety of reasons, and will never use it or never want to use it. Like I think for those students, it's like, okay, well, now the standards are higher because of everyone else. And here I am, with all my prior experiences, and I'm not using the same thing they are. So I think we've really been grappling with that about like what to expect in the deliverables. But again, I think the process piece, I don't want to minimize the challenge of asynchronous classes. I was actually going to say that Courtney and I have been working with an instructor, and this person's again very deeply concerned about generative AI being used in less than productive ways, less academic integrity than ideal. And so we've talked a lot about him about how much should then the process of writing not be something that's hidden away when a student, goes home and has to write an essay at 2 a.m. Like how much can that writing just be a theme of the class of developing whatever that is and constantly re-engaging with it whenever they meet. So again, this won't speak to the problem of asynchronous classes or the fit challenges they face, I should say. But we've been talking a lot about like, why are we not making the work that students do really central to what happens when they meet and talk to each other or talk to an instructor? And again, I think the idea there is that it won't preempt any of these problems necessarily, but it just changes the vibes again to be that we are constantly engaging in this process. It is a long haul thing, not a thing you do 2 a.m. before it's due. And it's also, there's some level of social accountability, right? Like when you're saying, oh, these are my ideas and I'm sharing them with my peers for feedback, over multiple weeks. Again, the hope is that students are earnestly engaging in this and not trying to pass off something else as their own ideas. Because I think some students do feel that social accountability. They're much more motivated by thinking about how they engage with their peers, which has no relevance when they just submit an essay directly to Canvas that never even touches their peers' eyes. So I think that's something we've been talking also a lot about, but I apologize, that doesn't really address the asynchronous question at all.
Well, it's just that I'm just so very happy to hear that you actually do address the issue of this observable behavior, right? Observable products. There's got to be something tangible, and rubrics are just ideal for that. Because this is, as we talked about earlier, humanity aspect or soul or, love of learning, all those other things that nobody really knows what they mean. I mean, people have, I don't know, 12 faculty, 27 opinions as to, what those things mean. However, rubrics allow us to break those concepts down, right? Okay, humanity would be certain sentence structure or a certain expression of empathy, right? Or paying attention to my personal experience, things of that nature, right? So this is what ChatGPT could probably produce these days just as well. It's just that again, rubrics allow us to pay attention to those things and attest to the fact that they actually exist, that they've been presented in student work. So I agree with this the discussions about how to police AI and what to do with it. Well, obviously we can't put the lid back on the bucket, and pretend it never happened. It's just it's not going to happen, so we have to deal with it. It's just that for me, this aspect of asynchronous class is sort of like the best, maybe the worst case scenario, right? I mean, this is exactly where okay, what do we do now? In a sense that I, as a faculty member, faculty of record for the course, I am responsible for the prompt, right? Okay, so guys, listen, respond to this, and now they do. Is that enough?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just throw out there that I've seen some instructors essentially require almost like, for lack of a better word, like a journal, like a log. Like they're really encouraging students. They're like, I'm not going to grade you on this like right in this moment, but like you should try to work on these things and just keep essentially a very informal log of like how you're like developing your idea for this paper. And so again, sometimes they grade that, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they put it in a place where there's version history, sometimes they don't. Again, we can talk a lot about like what are the underlying motivations for that, but I think some of them are just like, oh, like even if it's just casual, like seeing you intellectually engaged with this thing is what I'm which is helpful for me when I'm trying to understand this final paper I'll see in a couple weeks. So I've seen some people do that where they're essentially like, again, asynchronously being like, I'm checking in on your log and maybe I'll like leave a comment or reply, like, you are grappling with this source and whether you should use it or not. Here's what I think. Like, yeah, I've seen that. I don't know how successful people feel that has been, but that's definitely something I've seen.
You have also mentioned something about the act of turning in the papers, right? That it's something that happens between the student and the faculty, right? So I wrote the paper, I turn it in, I get a grade with comments, hopefully, and that's for me to take. And the thing though is that especially in asynchronous class, I just find it sort of a misguided practice because we are losing all this energy that went into the production of the paper that's really pretty much closed off to the public scrutiny. It's when you think about it, okay, I should be proud of my work, right? And considering what you just said about the documentation or attempt to document the process, what if students were to create publicly visible, or let's just say at least for the benefit of the class, I'm not necessarily speaking of publicly right away, but if this were to be available to class, the process, the thinking process that happens over time, right? So week number one, okay, here's my reflection. Week number two, here's my reflection, and so forth. And I think that perhaps would be attestation to the fact that learning process is taking place, or at least that would help the discussion about that.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe I'll take away my slides so that it's easier for everyone to see
Mm,
each other. So yeah, I think one thing I'll just say is that I mean, I think in some ways I do agree with you that there are opportunities for things to be much more public. Again, I think there's something about the like idea of like, I'm just going to turn this in. I'm one of like 100 students. I'm just going to submit it. Some reader will give me a grade, and that's the end of the story. And maybe I phoned it in, I'll get a bad grade, but like that's my secret shame that I share with the reader, right? So I think there's something about that avenue that is not always the most productive. And so I agree that there's opportunities for things to be more public. And I actually think of that not just only from like the idea of like public scrutiny, but also just from the idea that I think what we've noticed from talking to students about why they might use things like ChatGPT in less than productive ways. I mean, there's some obvious ones, which are just our students are incredibly busy and overcommitted. I think these students face enormous pressures to take as many classes as they do, to be involved in as many extracurriculars, while some of them are caregiving for themselves, a parent, a child, working. Like, I'm sure people have this common, experience, especially when I used to teach community college, that happened all the time, right? Like people who have other stuff going on. And so that desperation, lack of time, that's really hard to solve being a reason. But another reason that I thought was really interesting for how many times students were like, oh, well, why not just have ChatGPT do it, was how much they just viewed the things we asked them to do as like such a waste of their time. Like I sensed with these highly schooled students that they are very disillusioned with a lot of our assignments. They're just like, you just want me to do this because you told me to. It's such a like silly exercise. This will go nowhere. It has no meaning in my life. And so I think not necessarily having public things be for like scrutiny, but even just like, again, as you say, being proud of their work. I think one of my favorite assignments that I was talking to an instructor about recently was that they basically had one of the assignments be workshopping a letter that would go to a congressperson. And they really absolutely were like, we're going to make this really strong. And I highly encourage you to send this letter. Of course, I don't think they forced them to send it, but it's like they were trying to appeal as much as possible for the student to believe that there were, again, some stakes and some meaning in the thing that they had spent so much time doing for class, right? Like just doing it for class is not very motivational versus if they perceive like, I mean, even if they just did like a lab report, I'm thinking like, I'm hoping the lab report isn't too much of a cookbook lab, but if it's an interesting lab report, it's like in this digital age when like students are going up for hoping to get a job and like a lot of things now are online, like just Google me, look at my LinkedIn. It's like, how nice would it be if they felt like more of their course assignments were things that they were like, this is something I could showcase to possible employers, right? I think it would be lovely if those things felt as meaningful as that they wanted to include it, that it felt helpful for their life goals. But I think a lot of them, again, are just so disillusioned, and sometimes they talk about really specific things like, I heard students disparaging the reader response paper. Like, you want me to just read this chapter and write a response? Why? So some of them were specific papers, but I think, again, in general, they just some of them feel really disengaged with their education. They're just like, I'm going to get a credential out of this, but why am I doing this? It's just because you told me to.
Absolutely spot on. And I think, Lina, would you like to speak to this? I think you made a really good point in chat, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I do a lot of work in rubrics as well. And I do get a lot of pushback sometimes. Melissa, we've worked together in
Yeah,
the past.
I know. I was like, I recognize you.
In the practicum. I work in Northwestern. And we do a lot of work with our students, and we do want to hear their perspectives about assessments and assignments, and in the age of AI, and again, I try to be very intentional about including student voice in everything that I do. So I do a lot of work in terms of listening to our students and learning about research in terms of motivation for students to persist, to graduate. And there's like all this literature that says that now more than ever, we need our assignments, our assessments to be aligned with students' needs and wants, because it's not the same anymore. There's like all these skills that they want to be able to achieve. College is expensive. AI is out there. So if they get a chance, I'm not saying, always give the benefit of the doubt, and students are very well intended. But if they don't find assignments meaningful, and they have ChatGPT Copilot there, if they don't find meaning in those assignments, they might be able to use that. And so like, yeah, we always talk about like, how do we make assignments more meaningful, relevant, and like process driven? So yeah, I think there's a lot of literature out there that speaks to that relevancy aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be negative, but it's like I think a lot of us in higher education are so aware of like how much the faith in what we do has really changed, or the value of what we do, our value proposition, if you will. And, I feel bad talking to some of my colleagues where it's like, I think they do meaningful work. And I think that's what they see themselves is like, oh, I'm transformational. Like when I work with a student, like the type of person they'll be and the skills they'll have and the way they think about and see the world will be so much different. And it's hard for me then to be like, okay, well, I've talked to WASC and they literally have this dashboard of like, here's how much money you'll make, here's how much debt you take on. What's that ratio? Is your ratio good? And it's like, is that what the public is really caring about? Like how there's just such a disconnect again between the way we think about what we're doing and the way we see our work and what maybe the public sees, the students see, government sees. And I think we need to bridge that better, right? I think we can see that there's a lot of utility. Ultimately, are we actually convincing students? And either they don't trust us for one reason or another, or just we don't have a very convincing argument for them. And I think we need to have more convincing arguments. And I think, again, this idea, unfortunately, of career relevance is really important to a lot of our students, either because of the debt they're taking on or because their dreams of social economic mobility. We should hopefully be able to speak to those. But even then, I think even just like scholarship, right? Like even if students were like, oh, well, I don't know if this will help me necessarily get that software engineering job, but like having something of value put out in the world that has my name on it is like makes me feel really good, right? Like, and very often that doesn't necessarily come out of a class. Like that comes out of like they're taking all these classes in all these units, and then they have to also then do this thing on the side to get that experience, right? And it's not even part of their core experience. So I think that's something we really have to think about is how much we can now bring these things into either the public eye in a really positive way, or again, just speak really to their motivations. And I know that's hard for some classes. I know sometimes classes are just like, it's a required gen ed. These students don't even want to be here. But I think it's something we just have to continuously try now more than ever.
Uh, Melissa, this is probably the most important challenge for us, right? How to make it relevant. It's just, I mean, when you think about it, what you just said, gen ed and students don't even want to be there. What are we doing to ourselves and to our students? And I think, is just really revealing this.
Mhm.
Because again, when you think about it, if a chat GPT can produce whatever, then what are we doing? In a
Yeah.
sense, I really, and I think that the gap between relevance and what's happening in the classrooms is something that we should address like yesterday, especially because ChatGPT is here. You have any doubts, ask, figure this out. Because
Mhm.
again, students, no matter the age, nobody likes to be told what to do without having meaning behind it,
Yeah.
right? And
Mhm.
why would we tell them what to do? Why can't they come up with things that they want to do? In math, in geography, in physics, in philosophy, why wouldn't we?
Yeah.
And that's the part, because again, that talking about the process, you would immediately move the focus on or responsibility for learning on students rather than on faculty. Well, I'm doing everything I can and they're just not getting it.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, this is perhaps my very spicy take, but I very often feel that issues around course design, course sequencing, like the curriculum and gen eds, I very often feel like it's this arbitrary legacy thing because we've designed things around academic departments, right? Like because of that setup, now it's like, oh, well, what classes are in our portfolio? And very often students don't think of their lives in this incredibly compartmentalized way, right? Like they don't go to philosophy 101 and think, oh, this like guy who wrote about philosophy, like that's cool. Some of them don't think it's very cool, but if there were ways in which it felt like it spoke to more of the different aspects of their lives, maybe they would at least have a way to connect and see value or be able to apply it. And so I worry a lot about how much we have these like inherited structures of things being cut in ways that we understand. And because we are the philosophy person who became philosophy faculty, we're like, oh, of course, I love all these things in our portfolio. I would take all of these. But then it's like, oh, well, we want students to have this experience, so we're going to require them to take intro philosophy. I mean, I'm really worried about that because again, I think it's kind of for students doesn't speak to them very much. I used to teach at Stanford, and Stanford thinks of itself as a liberal arts institution, but we have so many students who are like, I just want to be the next venture capitalist. I want to be the next software engineer. I want to be the next doctor. Like, don't waste my time, right? And so I was teaching in the gen ed, the first year requirement. I had a lot of students who probably did not want to be there. And the way we did it, they don't do this anymore, but the way we did it was we basically had a class that like the conceit of it was like to get students to read and write and talk, right? Like just these basic critical skills. And we would just like put the veneer of like, well, this is a class about cancer. Like that's my background is cancer biology. So it would be like, oh, we're going to engage and talk a lot about cancer. And there's so much of the biology of cancer, but cancer is incredibly economic driven, political, like there's so much more to it. And students actually can really engage in that, but they didn't even sign up until they were like, oh, well, I'm going to pick the one STEM version. Like we had a version that was like all these other disciplines, but they were like, okay, the STEM version, cancer. Okay, I'll pick that one. And so I feel like I would get them in the door because they're like, oh, cancer biology. And I'm like, I can talk cancer biology to you all day, but we're going to read and talk about like environmental injustices where some people are disproportionately exposed to pollutants and have much higher risk of cancer, and what is our responsibility now in the world. So it's like we kind of got them in the door with something that they could at least grab onto, but I worry that if it was just like, okay, we're just going to do this is freshman 101 basic reading, writing, talking, they'd be like, why am I here? I don't want to be here. And it's so hard to teach to those students. I really want to give full credit to all of my colleagues who have to be in that position. It's really, really hard.
So I agree. I think that this, the compartments, right, that we created with the departments, this is really very much to the detriment of general education and all these other things that we kind of like, hey, let's sit down there. I'll teach you something. It's good for you. So what happens, I think, is that we simply don't realize because of those compartments that there is, when you think of philosophy, okay, that could be pretty much linked with any discipline. That's just like you described, right? There is philosophy of language learning. There is philosophy of geography. There is philosophy of chemistry or physics or whatever, right? You can kind of like, combine those disciplines to your heart's content. And look, this is what students would be latching on to much with greater interest, I suppose, if this were clear to them, right? That just the scenario is that the biology of cancer is just a perfect example you just described. So that's something that again AI kind of like brings to our attention that students are here because they are pragmatic. They are pragmatic adults. These are not, even when you think of children, like who doesn't want to do something that they like to do, that they have interest in doing, right? So we are just human beings, and somehow we seem to be kind of like moving that aside because there's the department idea of what it is that you need to know and be able to do. And Ying is mentioning and making a comment. Would you like to speak to this if you don't mind, because that you're speaking directly to the value of higher education.
Yeah, reading Ying's question about if credentials do not matter much in the job market and higher education does not offer credentials, I'd be curious what you mean by that. Because when I said credentials, part of me, I was just meaning like a degree. Like, how much value is it in seeing that someone has a bachelor's or master's or PhD or whatever? Like, we presume it has value and that would affect like what jobs you're eligible for. But I feel like we care about that a lot, right? Like there's so many jobs where I'm like, yo, you want a PhD person for this job? Like we care a lot in higher education, but I'm like, oh, I don't know if that is as relevant in or will continue to be as relevant in some even specialized professions. But will students still care to come to higher education? I mean, there's two parts of this to me is like, I think there's still for some the dream of college. I think some students kind of have that dream, and I just worry that we kill their dream really early. I think, again, this idea of like, oh man, I'll go to college and I'll have so much freedom and I'll get to pursue what I want. And there's this thing I found really interesting in high school, and I'm hoping I'll get a job, but I don't know what the jobs even look like because I've never, I love chemistry and I've never met a chemist in my life based on where I'm from or something. Like, I think there's still this dream, and I just worry so much about like the way they enter college and like get fed into the machine of college. I worry that we kill that dream. So I wonder again, as more and more people talk about like I've definitely seen rhetoric in places where people are like, college is a waste of time. Like, I did it and it was a waste of my time. Like, I see that. And I think we need to try to think more about what kind of experiences we offer our students, because then they just go on and tell everyone else about their bad time. I also just think it's a big problem, again, with government and policy. I'm preaching again to the choir because all y'all are interested in assessment, but again, my experience interacting with WASC, I was part of ALA, if anyone's done that, the accreditation liaison, no, accreditation leadership academy, pardon me. I was part of that program for a year, and it was just, again, we talked a lot about accreditation at high level, and I think accreditation in many ways is viewed almost like car insurance. It's like trying to prevent the worst case scenario of like you shouldn't go to a not accredited institution. Like I think that's what we convey is like car insurance. Don't go there. It's going to be a horrible accident if you go down that path. But it's like I feel like it could be so much more, right? And we kind of tell ourselves, oh, it's continuous improvement, and we're engaging in the academic peer review process. And again, I really worry that like we can say all that and then the public is looking at this return on investment dashboard and looking at like ratios of debt to income, right? And that's all they're like really getting out of what we're doing this whole time. It's like I think we're just not really compelling in terms of showing the evidence that students get this transformational learning. Like
Mm,
somehow we're just like showing it to each other if we even have
mm,
it, which again,
mm.
some of us struggle to even get that in the first place. And then we're just showing it to each other so that we get approval. And again, we get accredited, which means that we're not like avoided with all like at all costs, but that we're not really again selling to the public that we actually know that students have these transformational experiences. And maybe if they're not having them, maybe that's like we should at least make sure that they have something like that the evidence is again compelling. Um, yeah, the college experience. It's like, I think there's some students who go in with, again, this dream that it's like going to be something great. And it's a social thing, right? Like, it's like a coming of age thing that maybe they're thinking that it'll be really important for like networking, both on this like really professional level, but also just like making friends, right? Like a lot of our younger
Yeah.
generations are very lonely. So I think there's a bit of that. And I just worry that we, again, kill that feeling really early on. Like they go to college and take classes in spite of, like they're still having friends and meeting colleagues. And then unfortunately, they also have to take classes at the same time. So yeah, I'm sorry, I rambled on and on, but I think there's a lot of levels of the issue.
Yeah, well, the social interaction of learning that
Mhm.
cannot possibly be denied. I mean, obviously, we are social creatures no matter what, and I will always be reaching out to people who share same interests, like the chemistry, example you used earlier. It's just to test actually what I believe Ying mentioned earlier, the value of higher education. A few months ago, I had a conversation with ChatGPT. How can I get a PhD in astrophysics, which is the field I'm not familiar with at all? I have no idea what it is. And it's told me I needed to finish certain high school courses or college courses. These are the college courses I need to take. This is physics, math, and chemistry, blah, blah, blah. Then I would have go get my master's degree. Here's the sequence of courses, and this is the PhD thesis. And then it gave me 5 ideas about the dissertation that is very likely to be resonating 5 years from now, which I thought
Mhm.
was very revealing. On top of it, it gave me a list of free online courses that I could take to
Yeah.
get a PhD in astrophysics. I was just completely blown away because again it's nothing but my own agency, right? It's what I want to do with my time and resources that are available to me to get where I want to be. And if
Mhm.
astrophysics is my thing, then see, I don't have to be going making an appointment with a counselor, looking for a parking lot, or finding spot in the parking lot, and then getting in line and waiting for someone to serve me and then tell me, these are the prerequisites, yeah, but don't forget you have to take philosophy class and then there's psychology, and then, if we have room in your math class, then we'll take you, kind of a thing. So
Yeah.
so again, the structure as we know it seems to be crumbling.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just don't know what the safety net is, when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I want to acknowledge we're at time, so some people are
Oh, sure,
probably
of
leaving.
course. It's no, no,
Um,
no. Of
I
course.
all I
Perfectly.
want to acknowledge is Johan, I think your question and point is really interesting. I think if you talk to some faculty, they do not see higher education as purely a means to feed the job market.
That's right.
Again, I'm just quoting faculty. Some faculty feel very strongly that there's either something else that's more important in terms of a purpose, or there's more of a purpose than just that. So I don't think there's
So,
an agreement on what the purpose
so,
is.
and I agree. This is, that's raised often. The question that I have, okay, so who doesn't come to college to get a job? I just would like to know what is the percent of population who don't end up having a vocation somewhere, right? Making money as a result of college education. I mean, I agree. We can talk about,
Mhm,
the
mhm.
love of learning and, oh yeah, those wonderful insights I'm getting in my geography class. But bottom line is, I am here to get a job because 10 years from now, I would like to have a good living.
Yeah. And again, I think that there's a very big discrepancy in terms of what students are thinking and what faculty are
And what
thinking.
faculty are thinking.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. To be continued.
Yes,
Melissa,
thank you so
thank you
much.
so much. Gosh, just great discussion. Thank you very much.